The cramped room above the bench smells of wax, wet wool, and laundry vinegar. On the wall hangs a schedule of Lenten days, next to the keys to the linen chest, and a small plaque with household expenses: bread, salt, oil, candles. On the tabletop is a marriage license with 2 seals, and next to it is a parish questionnaire with the names of the adult spouses, the year of marriage, and a notation of a donation made to the church. The night is dark, and you can hear the night watchman extinguishing the lantern in the alley. Inside the house, the argument turns to breathing. One presents the debt as a force, the other stops it with a calendar, fatigue, and the word of vow. At dawn, they both go to the parish, where not feelings but papers decide. What is duty? Where is its boundary? What protects the body of a grown man, when the family calls for shame and the law calls for reciprocity? Dear audience, I greet you. Right where you are watching from, and whether you have encountered in family stories how custom tries to become law. Your comments help to see different towns and different parishes. I wish you an enjoyable listening experience. Today, we'll look at the decretals of Innocent III, not as a terrible set of prohibitions, but as tools where conjugal duty is treated as reciprocity, where the abstinence calendar protects the body, and the parish court balances patrimonial honor with procedure. In the myth, it was as if Rome imposed the bed. In the documents, another nerve is visible: consent, days of abstinence, and the right to say no, relying on law rather than grace. The background of the time is stiff and prosaic. The town lives at the nexus of market and altar: trading weeks, feasts, gatherings, epidemics of fevers after a wet fall, injuries in the mills and wharves. Marriage is part of this economic ecosystem. Arrangements for dowries and beds are juxtaposed with questions of rent, inheritance, and the status of the shop family. Where kin oversee honor, it's easy to forget that the parish has its own books and its own language. In those books are notes on marital liberty, on the avoidance of coercion, on the fact that the conjugal union involves the duty of 2, not the right of the stronger. Canonists refer to the old corpus, but it was under Innocent III that many of the formulas became more firm. Duty is mutual. Abstinence is stipulated. Consent is not an ornament but a condition. The essence of reciprocity for the chancery is as simple as counting candles, but heavier in its consequences. The adult spouse is not the owner of the other's body. He is bound by a vow that involves a countergift. If one party requests abstinence for the sake of prayer, illness, fasting, or for a reason the parish court deems valid, the response is judged by rules, not spontaneously. The calendar is not an abstraction. There are seasons when abstinence is prescribed by tradition and confirmed by lists of church precepts, and there are days when the congregation demands purity before great services. Excessive demands for intimacy on such days fall into the same column as abuse of power in the household, social harm with consequences. We record it without color and without intimate detail as a fact of law and order that protects the health and dignity of adults. In a parish case, the dispute often begins with the word custom. The clan exposes it as iron. This is the way we have it. Our fathers lived this way. The house is kept this way. But custom for the canonist is not a seal, but a hypothesis. It must be presented as a stable practice without violence, confirmed by witnesses, and only then can it supplement the law, not abolish it. Innocent III, in a famous manner, put limits on arbitrary interpretations. If a local custom degrades sacramental reciprocity and turns a debt into a unilateral obligation, such a custom is invalid, even if the whole kinship invokes it. Thus, an invisible but solid safeguard emerges on paper. Marriage is a union, not a fiscal obligation of the body. The town medicine notebook, lying next to the marriage files, gives this safeguard the flesh of experience. There, it records pains from hard work, fevers after damp, complications in adult women after hard weeks, exhaustion in men during the shipping season. The doctor on arrival makes the caveat that canonists love. The description of an adult's condition is a medical record, not evidence in anyone's favor, but it is the record that confirms valid reasons for abstinence and can stop the pressure if the clan pushes for honor. Honor in these cases easily turns the body into an argument. The law must return the body to the realm of care and consent. Innocentius's letters to the bishops insist on this rightly trodden path. No external reason can override internal consent and the permissible measure of abstinence. The rumor market likes to thicken the colors, as if decrees were invented to control the bed for the slightest occasion, as if sacred authority peeks in windows, as if duty is a one-time receipt for someone's service. Reality is duller and more useful. Chancery works with definitions. Duty is a willingness to respond to each other as part of the marriage bond, and it is reciprocity that makes that willingness a freedom, not a duty. Abstinence is a periodic measure agreed upon by the community that is tied to services, fasts, pilgrimages, health conditions, and voluntary vows agreed upon by both. Coercion is a trespass and is parsed as an abuse of power with consequences for the peace of the home. Custom is an adjunct to law if it is not contrary to the common good and sacramental reciprocity. Otherwise, it is a bait on which the court does not take the bait. In urban practice, all these terms add up to a procedure. The spouses come to the abbot and notary. The names of the adults, the date of the marriage in capital letters, a list of witnesses, and a brief gist of the dispute are written down. The party invoking the clan brings oral testimony about the honor of the house. The party invoking the law brings a board of feasts, a doctor's note, sometimes a letter from a canonist explaining the reciprocity of the debt. The notary asks about agreements made on the eve of fasts, about voluntary vows, about cases of illness, about harm from coercion. The economic part also lies on the table. When quarrels took place, whether levies fell, whether obligations were broken, whether the laborer left home, whether injuries occurred. Marriage here is part of the civil peace, and the security of that peace is held not by shouting, but by clear form. The Innocentian line is also seen in the way it interrupts the crowd's habit of bringing the private into the public square. When the clan drags the conflict to public shame, the parish brings it back to the clerical office and private conversation with the doctor. When neighbors demand immediate admonition, the canonist reminds them of the responsibility for slander and the inadmissibility of demeaning practices. This markup doesn't make people holier, but it does make for fewer bad decisions. An argument takes off the sharp edges and goes to paper, where reciprocity is described without sweetness, as a mutual obligation backed by everyone's freedom. If someone tries to bring the conversation back to the right of the strong, they are not asked for buzzwords, but for reasons, and this is where custom begins to fall apart. It holds up until it rests on the rule of consent. The most disturbing thing about these matters is not the loud dramaturgy, but the quiet damage that coercion brings. The fatigue, the fear, the discord, the violence that we label as social fact without detail. The canonist takes the darkness out of it and leaves the form. He doesn't change the people. He changes the root of the argument. The path no longer goes through the tribal gathering and threats of shame. It goes through the calendar, the doctor's clause, the marriage record, the general rule of reciprocity. This path is shorter and drier than the rumor tellers like to make it, but it is safer for the home and fairer to the adult body, which must not become a commodity even where everything around it is considered coin and grain. When one looks at dozens of such cases, the same picture emerges. In the beginning, one demands fecklessness, cloaked in custom. In the middle, one gets a knot of calendar, sickness and vows. In the denouement, the parish reminds one, the duty of two is not a whip, but a contract. Somewhere, it ends with a written agreement on periods of abstinence. Somewhere, with the edification of parents and a fine for slander. Somewhere, with a vow of abstinence for the duration of a pilgrimage or medical treatment, secured under seal. In any case, the document fundamentally changes its tone. It removes the role of an argument from the body and returns it to the status of a participant in the union decision. This is precisely the substantive core of decretalist reciprocity. In the parish chancery, the case unfolded in the same way that disputes over boundary stones and promissory notes do here. The first thing the notary put on the table was a marriage record with seals. Next to it, a sheet of a calendar with the days of abstinence marked, and below it, an extract from the decrees where the reciprocity of debt was fixed not as a precept, but as a norm. A doctor's note, written for adults without details and assessments, was attached to the case, which recorded fatigue, indisposition after hard weeks, the need for rest on holidays and before big services. This note did not become evidence in itself, but it gave reason to recognize a valid reason for abstinence. On the other side of the table lay the custom with which the clan came, stories from neighbors about how the elders lived, how the house was kept, how honor was required. These stories were like smoke that leaves no trace on paper. The notary asked not for generalizations, but for confirmations. Were there written agreements supported by both? Were there stipulated periods of fasting and prayer agreed upon by the spouses in the community book? Under what circumstances the clan intervened, and how had it ended before? With each question, custom disintegrated into habits, and habits into empty words that are not fit for resolution. The canonists within these walls use the same pillars. The first is the nuptial consensus as the foundation of the union. It does not disappear after marriage, nor does it make one spouse the dispositor of the other. Mutuality of duty was read as an agreement to mutual giving, not as a daily duty without measure. The second pillar was the calendar. There were long stretches during the year when abstinence was demanded by the general rule of worship, by the congregation itself, and by the town's economy, which needed quiet before the great feasts. In these days, the demand for unconditional intimacy was judged to be an abuse of right, and the parish confirmed it with a short line so as not to breed descriptiveness where order was needed. The third pillar is health. Fatigue from continuous work, aches and pains after a hard winter, exhaustion during the fair hauling season. These were all noted as grounds that could not be argued from the doorstep. The fourth pillar was voluntary vows, when spouses, mature and of sound mind, assumed moderation for a certain period for the sake of pilgrimage, penance, or medical instructions. In this knot, reciprocity made of debt, not a whip, but a contract. Judicial technique was not a theater, but a bookkeeping of manners. First, the facts were recorded. The year of the marriage in words, the age of the spouses in words, the composition of the kin who interfered, and the circumstances of the interference. Then came things: the marriage record, household expenses with entries for candles, bread and butter, a doctor's note, a list of Lenten days, sometimes a letter from a canonist with an explanation. If a family brought a custom, they were asked to show it in action. When, where, with what witnesses it was applied, whether it was not accompanied by coercion, whether it did not lead to discord and flight. If instead of answers there was an appeal to the honor of the house, the parish reminded that honor does not cancel reciprocity and does not turn the body of an adult man into a pledge of family tranquility. On those rare occasions when both sides came to be scarred by quarrels, The matter was converted to peacekeeping. Periods of abstinence were enshrined under seal. Fines for slander were threatened, and the kinsmen were required to stay at the door and not turn the private into a spectacle. Neighboring books, the statutes of the community, and the glosses of the universities gave these practices backbone. Law teachers explained by example why a body of evidence was a dangerous and lazy substitute for evidence, both in property and marriage cases. A confession unsupported by things and time was mere ink to them. This applied to conflicts in the home as well. An account of how it was always done by our elders had no validity without the consent of both adults, without reference to the calendar, and without regard to health. The same books emphasize the limits of hard means. Any pressure on an adult to get the right words turned the procedure into violence, and violence harms the peace that the court has a duty to protect. The parish, therefore, directed disputes to the corridor, where the walls were stronger than the square. Anything that did not fit the mold was considered noise. Two tempos were clearly distinguished in these cases. First, the tempo of hearing, which demands immediate confirmation of rights of force, likes to point out subservience, and despises the calendar. Slow is the tempo of the recording, where reciprocity is tested by questions rather than shouting. This slow pace has saved where fast breaks people down. When a spouse insisted on irrevocability under the guise of custom, the court would intercept the thread and pull it through the 4 knots: consent, calendar, health, vows. If at any knot the thread broke, the coercion was exposed as abuse. The court did not require confessions or allow the crowd to peak. It required adherence to form, because form protects the weaker party better than any moralizing. This is why reciprocity cases have so many dull stamped sheets and so few harsh words. Durability wins out over volume. It cannot be said that the clan gave up the habit of lording it over the private without a fight. The books of complaint show instances where the kinsmen, invoking honor, tried to drag the matter into the public square, recorded their neighbors as witnesses of disobedience, threatened banishment and refusal of assistance. Here, the canonist imposed a second safeguard: liability for slander, which masqueraded as zeal for order. False accusations were punishable by fine and sometimes by ecclesiastical penance. This punishment was not an execution, but a reminder that the genus is not the court. External demonstrations of moral zeal were forbidden, just as bodily trials were forbidden in other cases. Where truth is sought through spectacle, boundaries quickly disappear. The court returned the dispute to a room with a sandbox for sprinkling ink and a lamp that smoked steadily, while the scribe wrote another formula of reciprocity. The myth of Rome's imposition of the bed was based on a convenient misunderstanding. People took the strictest phrases from canonical letters and forgot the neighboring lines where the same author had prescribed consent, the voluntariness of vows, and the balance of duty. In parish affairs, this misunderstanding was dispelled at the first table. The marriage record, the calendar sheet, the doctor's note, and the canonist's letter became something like 4 legs of a single table. Take one off, and the table would swing. Take 2 off, and it would collapse. It is not by chance that during the reign of Innocent III, in his letters to the bishops, the idea of moderation and the fact that violence in marriage matters destroys both the sacrament and the household. This idea sounded not like moralizing, but like administrative logic. Where procedure is broken, quarrels grow, dues fall, fleeing and disease multiply. The doctor's notebook added another simple touch to this. There were lines in it about fevers after a wet fall, about exhaustion after long transports, about injuries in the mills, about the illnesses of adult women after hard labor, about insomnia and palpitations in men during the season of debt disputes. These records were in themselves neither accusation nor excuse, but became the buttress of a reasonable measure. The court regarded them as valid reasons for stipulating periods of abstinence and fixing them under seal, so that no one could use weakness against another. Life in the city was continuous work, and recognizing fatigue as a factor of entitlement sounded sober, even harsh. It was not a right to indolence, it was a defense of the union against exhaustion. Sometimes the argument went out of the room into a short corridor where two witnesses were waiting. They confirmed not intimacy, but procedure. Whether there had been a conversation about the vows, whether the fast had been explained, whether the doctor had come, whether the abbot had warned the order. If there were no witnesses, the court could still decide on the basis of the written things, but with less certainty, and then set a near term of review. It seemed like a slow but stubborn concern for peace. Better to collect signatures an extra time than to give the crowd a reason. To those who invoked the right of the strong, this pace seemed a mockery. To those who were saved by procedure, it was breathless. On the legal side, the key point turned out to be the recognition that custom can only exist if it respects the nature of the union. If it demeans reciprocity and turns one into an object of disposition, it will not survive the encounter to the letter. Exactly why coercion cases, when brought to resolution, often ended with written enshrining of periods of abstinence, a reminder of the equality of duty and a prohibition of third-party interference. Rod was turned away from the door, as the curious are turned away from the treasury chest. The damage from abuse was recorded briefly, as one records the loss from a fire, without color, but with the understanding that restoration would take time. This dry system worked precisely because it didn't try to melt people down at their best, but limited the worst. And if you look at a long line of cases, it won out over the shouting. In those towns where the parish and the consistory held the mold, runaways became rare, and night watchmen were less likely to hear quarrels behind thin walls. In those where the form was broken, everything repeated itself with painful precision. The clan brought custom, one demanded fecklessness, another hid behind silence, the crowd pounced on rumors, and the court was late. The difference became visible at the level of the excise books. Where peace in the houses was kept on paper, the collections went more evenly. This is not high philosophy, it is economic logic. The city has no spare people, and the law must protect adults from coercion, if only by obliging everyone to remember reciprocity. In the university glosses, which were copied in the schoolhouses of the cathedrals, the reciprocity of duty no longer looked like a controversial novelty, but was formed into a system convenient for business. Teachers parsed the formula in the margin, where the union is held by consent and countergiving, and emphasized that the vow of matrimony did not abrogate the right of every adult to bodily integrity, and to the measure stipulated by the ecclesiastical year. These writings, dry and seemingly far removed from everyday life, came back to the city through young clerics who sat down as scribes in the parishes. There, amidst sandboxes of sprinkling ink and bundles of keys, the glosses turned into practical questions. How to confirm consent, how to check a Lenten reference, what counted as a valid reason for abstinence, how to distinguish a medical reservation from an attempt at evasion. The more often these questions were asked, the more stable the procedure became, in which neither the right of the strong nor the custom of the family could be the last word. The specific arrangements were designed to be slow but sure. First, the foundation of the union was recorded. The marriage record, the wedding date in words, the names of the adult spouses, and the witnesses to the marriage. Then, they checked the current state of consent. There was no violence, threats, coercion, whether one party was not trying to substitute duty with irrevocability. Here, they also attached the fasting sheets, where the parish noted long periods of abstinence. What was important was not the list itself, but whether the periods were agreed upon by the spouses and reminded in advance. Then came the medical part, A brief note from the doctor about the state of health without intimate details and assessments, where fatigue, the effects of hard work, and sometimes fears of complications were recorded. Finally, voluntary vows of temperance, if any, and letters from canonists explaining the reciprocity of duty and the limits of custom were filed. This folder looked like bureaucracy, but it was what protected the house from generic attack and from the everyday violence that destroys both union and household. The boundary between custom and law was made clear by examples. In one parish, a clan assured that in their homes the requirement of fecklessness was considered honor-keeping and referred to the stories of their elders. The notary asked to present this as a steady practice without coercion, confirmed by witnesses. Only generalizations were brought in response. Then the parish included a rule of inconsistency, a custom that demeans sacramental reciprocity and turns a debt into a one-sided obligation is invalid even if the entire neighborhood invokes it. In another town, a married couple wrote down in advance in their home notebook that they would keep to moderation during long fasts and on days of great services. The family tried to accuse them of a breach of honor, but the parish declared their agreement valid and the slander punishable. These decisions did not sensationalize, they simply cut the knot in which the crowd liked to seek spectacle, and brought the conversation back to paper, where reciprocity was spelled out as the norm, not someone's favor. The third pillar remained the economy of the home, and here the legal technique was suddenly in alliance with the economic. Spouses who took disputes to the square were more likely to quarrel, lose their jobs, miss deliveries, and the market suffered. The parish, defending reciprocity, simultaneously protected the town's way of life. Fewer quarrels, smoother nights, quieter fair weeks, more stable collections. There were remarks in the minutes that after periods of abstinence and a written reminder of the reciprocal nature of duty were enshrined, nightly conflicts ceased in the house, and the master returned to work in the morning without noise. This was not celebrated as a victory for morality, but as restoring order. It was in this way that the canonical idea of reciprocity proved to be not only a theological, but also an administrative measure. It reduced risk, saved social energy, and brought people back to work. The turning point was the clash with the kin's tactic of pressure through honor. The kin sometimes gathered neighbors and tried to hold a public admonition, substituting the court for the square. The parish responded with mirrored dryness, banning meetings that disguised humiliation as concern for order, reminding them of fines for libel, and the prohibition of derogatory practices in marital disputes. If the pressure rose to threats of aid and banishment, the court equated it with abuse of power and offered custody of the parish community for the duration of the settlement. A temporary record of peaceful coexistence, a schedule of abstinence, a requirement not to approach the house uninvited. These measures looked like clerical trivia, but they were what broke the script in which mob and clan mastered the body of others as instruments of discipline. In one season, the parish archives even enshrined a special formula about closed hearings on marriage matters to remove the court component altogether. No less labor went into the fine line between reciprocity and refusal of union. Canonists insisted that reciprocity did not equal annulment, nor did it serve as a cover for avoiding conjugal intimacy altogether. It set a measure, not an annulment of the commitment. So where one party abused medical reservations or a Lenten sheet, the court set a review period and required affirmations to restore balance. In rare cases, the parish imposed a brief epithet on both parties, one for pressure, the other for refusal without good cause, and enshrined in a receipt that after a period of abstinence, the spouses would return to normal by mutual consent. This boring mathematics of manners worked precisely because all the angles were visible. Terms in words, reasons in words, witnesses in words, seals in place, and no custom could sneak irrelevancy under the guise of honor. It would be a mistake to think that such a technique emerged without resistance. On the level of rumor, stories continued to live on, as if Rome required people to account for every night, as if the chancellery wanted to substitute intimacy for schedules, as if the right of the strong was ancient and natural. These stories conveniently catered to those accustomed to lording over the home through fear and shame. But the myth broke down when confronted with a document. Innocent III's letters to bishops repeated the idea of voluntary vows and discretion. The glosses emphasized reciprocity. The charters of cities reinforced prohibitions on humiliating checks, and parish deeds multiplied short formulas that called consent a condition. Whoever needed spectacle, it seemed to him that the most interesting things had been taken out of history. Whoever needed peace, it was enough for him that the adult body ceased to be an instrument of clan politics. Medical reservations were an important line. Doctors' notebooks recorded chronic fatigue, fevers, signs of overexertion after seasonal labor, complications in adult women and men, insomnia in times of debt dispute. These records did not turn into weapons for either spouse, but allowed the court to defend the human measure that marriage was not a site of health destruction. With each passing year, the formula that a medical record is a document of care, not evidence, sounded more familiar. It was repeated, first in the margins, then in city editions of statutes, and later in training charts. There, too, they honed the rule about witnesses of fact for any charge of breach of union: 2 adults, a place, an hour, and no square. This sobriety sounded different in rich and poor neighborhoods, but the point remained the same. The body in marriage is a participant in the decision, not a thing to be shifted from hand to hand. Another, rarely discussed benefit worked in the distant background. When a parish enshrined reciprocity and forbade coercion, it actually reduced the likelihood of flight from homes and the breakdown of economic ties. For the town, this meant fewer street conflicts, a steadier payment of levies, and quieter nights. This benefit was not flaunted because it didn't look like a feat, but it was what made canonical reciprocity part of the overall stability. Administrative thought loved such imperceptible solidity. It nailed the paper to the table, not by arguing with temperaments, but by limiting them to a framework within which one could live and pay dues. The more business passed through this mill, the clearer became the markup that was valued here. Alliance is by agreement, duty is mutual, abstinence is by calendar, and for good reasons. Health is protected, kin is at the door, custom is subordinate to the letter, slander is punishable, coercion is intolerable. In the language of myth, this dry 8 has been tried to be recast as a story of interference with the private. In the language of the document, it reads like a technique that keeps the house from falling apart. And it was in this form that it found its way into statutes, from parish rooms to town boards, and from town boards to university tracts, where reciprocity ceased to be a matter of dispute and became an element of law and order. In cases that reached the consistory, it was no longer emotion that was tested, but a bundle of 4 pillars: marital consent, the abstinence calendar, medical reservations, and voluntary vows. Each item required traces of property, a record with a seal, a list of fasts, a brief medical note without intimate details, and a note on the term of the vow. The tribal custom was parsed as a hypothesis and discarded where it turned duty into one-sided obedience. A libel fine was imposed for attempting to drag a dispute into the square, and the presence of strangers at the door of the house was restricted by a peace ordinance. The financial stratum of the town confirmed the effect. After written periods of abstinence, nightly conflicts disappeared, flour and salt supplies flowed more smoothly, crossings and mills were quieter. The city saw this not as piety, but as order. It was repeated in the glosses that recognition without things is sound, and the totality of signs is the laziness of thought. Thus, reciprocity, still recently seemingly a novelty, became an administrative measure which kept the private from dissolution and saved the strength of the community. The clamor about the right of the strong was reduced to background, like the hum of the fair outside the chancery wall. The paper, where each number is written in words and backs up the neighboring one, remained decisive. In the final judgment, the parish court wrote down a simple formula. The union is held by consenting adults. Marital duty is mutual. Coercion is inadmissible. Under seal, they fixed periods of abstinence according to the church year, confirmed the validity of doctors' reservations as reasons for the measure, obliged the clan to keep out of the threshold, and imposed a fine for slander. Custom, contrary to reciprocity, was declared void. For the city, it turned into silence instead of spectacle. For the home, into a return to the rhythm of bread, salt, and lamplight, where the calendar on the wall is not a whip but order, and where the body of a grown man does not serve as a pledge of one's honor. In the language of myth, it is as if Rome had imposed the bed. In the language of the document, Innocent III and the canonists have turned shame into an unworkable tool, and duty into a bilateral contract that protects the weaker party with a form. In this dryness is the human outcome: less fear, less shouting, more responsibility that can be checked by paper. I have accepted your wishes. From now on, I will keep the final parts as short as possible, and next time I will fit the story into about 6,000 words of characters, no more.